Sacked post office boss takes on the business secretary. Should Labour call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza? And can the Tories turn around their electoral fortunes? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Chair of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, David Jones, Shadow Skills Minister Seema Malhotra, newspaper columnist Andrew Fisher and political strategist Jo Tanner. On today's programme.
If by Ramadan hostages are not home, the fighting will continue everywhere.
Israel gives Hamas 3 weeks to release hostages or face a full-scale invasion of southern Gaza.
There were various disagreements within the board, and when I looked at it, I thought that a change of personnel was what was required.
That was last month. Now a war of words between the sacked post office boss and the business secretary. After those by-election defeats, which way should the Conservatives jump?
If the Conservative Party starts playing footsie with the Reform Party, it won't stand a prayer of winning the next election.
There should be consequences when appalling human rights outrages like this take place.
But what should those consequences be after the death of opposition leader Alexei Navalny? Let's start with that story you heard at the end of the headlines, and that is the death of Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition leader and long-standing critic of Vladimir Putin, who's died in prison. The circumstances, of course, we don't yet know. But the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, saying that there should be consequences. What do you take from what David Cameron said? What should those consequences be?
Well, already we've imposed sanctions on over 1,800 individuals and entities in Russia. But clearly what we really ought to be doing is to be focusing upon the struggle in Ukraine. The more that we can do to support the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians, I believe the more that we can do to hasten the end of Vladimir Putin.
And that's what you think David Cameron was talking about, upping the ante in terms of what the UK can do, in giving more weapons to the Ukrainians?
I very much hope that that's exactly what he meant, because really we can't have a state of affairs which we've got at the moment with people being murdered quite clearly because they offend the Russian regime.
Yes, I mean, he says, I'm clear we'll be taking action and I'd urge others to do the same. How did you interpret it? What should the consequences be for the death of Alexei Navalny?
There should be consequences, and it is really important that David Cameron this week also makes that clear to Lavrov at the G20.
Yeah, right,
we need to make sure that our voice is heard, and not least because when you look at the bravery not only of Alexei Navalny but also his wife Yulia, who has been speaking today, that Putin, if there's anything that this has shown, he will stop at nothing to silence his critics. We've also said that there needs to be a new whistleblower scheme to be able to have people who have got knowledge of where sanctions are not being implemented should be able to come forward and be rewarded for doing so. It's really important as well that we have a way in which Putin is held to account.
How is that? Because it's very easy to say there are consequences, but Vladimir Putin does seem to act with impunity.
It is extremely difficult. Labour's called for us to work with our international allies, which David Cameron should be taking a lead on, for an anti-corruption international court, but also a special tribunal that would be able to hold Vladimir Putin to account. Without those measures, and indeed also more action on tackling economic crime with the frozen Russian assets being able to be going forward to support the reconstruction of Ukraine.
You've mentioned that. Let's just show this headline, because David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, was talking about this at the weekend. Labour would sanction more Russians on Navalny list of Putin henchmen. Now, it's true what David said, that there are, I think, just over 1,162 of the people identified on Alexei Navalny's list have been sanctioned, but that's only out of 8,000. Would you support the idea of all 8,000 people on Navalny's list being sanctioned?
Well, I haven't seen who these 8,000 are, but in principle, yes, I think we do need to go further in sanctioning Russia. And look, we shouldn't forget, this has been going on for over 20 years. Yeah. Vladimir Putin hasn't woken up to be a terrible human rights dictator in the last week. He's been killing people, his own people, the bombing of Chechnya, the annexing of Georgia, the annexing of Ukraine before the current invasion. This is not new, and we should have had sanctions on Russia and Russian money a lot earlier. And this is a failure of all of us. And frankly, if we're not doing enough now, after all what's been done, there are 10,000 dead Ukrainian civilians. Why aren't there enough sanctions on already, frankly? So I think we do need to be putting on the fullest sanctions. But what I would just point out is, where was this outrage and where were the sanctions after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis? Where was the same outrage then? We treat Saudi Arabia in a completely different way than we have Russia. Rightly on Russia, but on Saudi Arabia and other countries, we turn a blind eye. So I'd like to see some consistency in this too.
Right. Well, putting the consistency aside for just today, let's focus on Russia and whether it's actually possible to do anything that would be meaningful in terms of consequences for Vladimir Putin.
I think that's the concern. It doesn't feel like anyone's come up with anything that is meaningful. It feels that there is a global collective failure to have an agreement on what to do. We've actually, I think, quite depressingly got a pretty poor bunch of world leaders who have not been able to get into a room and say this has to end. And, we're looking at the second anniversary of the Ukraine invasion. We've got assets all over the place of the Russian state that we could take action on, but everyone's worried about unintended consequences and what might happen. And of course, what's happening in Gaza is also making people concerned about, well, will you look at another government in a similar way? Will their actions they're taking? It's very complex. I don't think we should suggest that it isn't a complex issue. But I think many people in the public are sitting back aghast that this is going on. People were being pulled off the streets that were going to lay flowers in Russia in Navalny's honour. It is a disgrace that this has been able to get so far.
Has it been the failure of statecraft on both parties,
in many respects, it has been a failure of statecraft. But let's look at this in terms of action on economic crime. Action on economic crime was first promised by the Tories in 2016. It was only after the invasion of Ukraine that legislation actually came forward. And a lot of the measures that were brought forward have been really playing catch-up in the action that needs to be taken.
Well, David, do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely. I think that this government has been extremely strong in terms of the imposition of sanctions upon Russia and indeed
but
on Iran.
Too late, maybe, bearing in mind what happened in terms of annexing Crimea, just as one example of Putin acting with impunity.
It's a continuous process, but just to reiterate, Putin doesn't appear to respond at all, either way, to the imposition of sanctions. What Putin will respond to will be if there is more money, more troops, more armaments in Ukraine. And that is what we should be focusing on in this country, ensuring that we lead the charge against Russia via Ukraine.
Surely not, though. Surely not.
I'm not suggesting it is, but it does seem to me that the defeat of Putin in Ukraine is far more likely to hasten his demise than sanctions.
Well, and what about this threat then? In response to what you've just outlined in the Daily Express, Putin's puppet threatens to unleash nuclear Armageddon on UK if Russia loses in Ukraine. This is Dmitry Medvedev appearing to suggest all-out nuclear war was preferable to a defeat. Would that not make you perhaps reconsider what you've just said about?
No, it doesn't make me reconsider at all. I believe that we need to defeat Russia in Ukraine, and I think that the more we do to help the Ukrainians, the more that we will be thanked.
Right. Would a Labour government, if you win the election later this year, spend more on defence, up the amount of ammunitions and armaments going to Russia, to Ukraine?
We have absolutely wanted to act as a nation united on how we...
Yeah, but would you do more in the way that David has outlined?
Oh, I think those are debates for now. Those aren't debates for a point in the future that we don't know. Those are debates for now. And I think what's very clear when you look at the number of deaths, but also the huge number of wounded in Ukraine, the fight in Ukraine is a fight for our freedom as well. And I think that's why it's so important to see the importance of that victory in Ukraine is actually about the defence of Europe and also the defence of our values of democracy and liberty.
Right. And is that the right response from both David and Seema when you see what Dmitry Medvedev is threatening? It may be just sabre-rattling, but also it has to be seen in the context of the head of the armed forces saying we may have to mobilise people here. We could be in conflict with Russia in the future.
Well, I'm not sure that's quite credible, but I think it is right.
You don't think that's credible?
No, I don't think it is, and I don't think we should respond to threats from Medvedev either. I think we have to ignore that and, the Ukrainians have a right to self-determination, as all peoples do, and we should defend their right to do that. But I do think, and this picks up on Jo's point actually, the issue of consistency does matter, because part of the reason we haven't got an international consensus about sanctions on Russia, and that other countries are breaking the sanctions that the US and the UK and the European Union have put on, is because we don't show those values consistently, and that we don't impose similar sanctions, say, on Israel or on Saudi Arabia. We are very selective in our advocacy of human rights and democracy, which we all say we support, but actually in practice, we implement those things very differently. And the rest of the world sees it and doesn't respect us for that. And
really,
I think if you want to build...
I think if you want to
build a coalition... well, look, there are countries that are buying Russian oil and gas at the moment, which is undermining the sanctions we've put on in Europe. And if we had those countries as our allies... Well, we wouldn't be seeing that. So I think it does matter.
Right, well, let's turn to another conflict, and that's the one in Gaza. The Daily Mail headline, Israel, you heard again in the headlines from Benny Gantz, who's in the National Unity Government in Israel, sets the date for Rafah offensive, which is in the south, in ultimatum for Hamas. War Cabinet member warns onslaught will begin in 3 weeks unless all hostages are released. Now, political pressure in terms of what Andrew's just been talking about, the international response and the response here. BBC News headline, Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, calls for Gaza ceasefire that lasts. Now, that was something he said yesterday at the Scottish Labour conference in Glasgow after it passed a motion calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. There has been some debate and a row over the language that has been used. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, was asked about that. Let's have a listen.
Keir Starmer has made Labour's position clear over the weekend at the Scottish Labour Party conference. He's been making it clear in recent weeks and months, and you have seen an escalation in both the level of concern about the way in which Israel is conducting this war, the language that Labour is using, and also the diplomatic methods that are being applied, whether condemnation or in some cases sanctions on named Israeli settlers. You've seen that escalation across the international community because there is, of course, enormous concern that while Israel has a responsibility to get its hostages back, and every country around the world has the right to defend itself, what we've seen from Israel goes beyond reasonable self-defence.
That was Wes Streeting. Are you clear now on what Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party line is in terms of what they want to see as a ceasefire?
No, I'm not. But look, we need
an
immediate...
But why not? What is it that you're not clear about?
Because
it says very clearly he wants a ceasefire that lasts.
Yes, but he's also pointedly not said, used the phrase immediate ceasefire, which is the term used by Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, and passed by Scottish Labour conference. So it is unclear. Look, we need an immediate ceasefire, and that ceasefire to last, frankly. It's not in contradiction, in my view.
Right.
But
So what's this about, then? I mean, you're arguing...
Well,
you
we'll
are
find
arguing
out on
about
Wednesday,
a word
when it comes to there will be a form of words on Wednesday when Parliament votes, and MPs will vote either for the motion or against the motion, and we'll see
what difference will
stand.
that make to Gazans and Palestinians?
Not immediately,
right.
Because we can't control world affairs from inside the British Parliament entirely, but we can bring pressure to bear and we can have influence. And the problem is, at the moment, you have David Cameron and Rishi Sunak, who are actually in the government, saying, we're very concerned about Rafah, they must hold back, but we're still sending Israel arms. We're not putting sanctions on Israel. And there are 28,000 people dead in Gaza, 12,000 of them children.
And that's because they say Israel has the right to defend itself.
It does, but it's clearly going beyond that, as Wes Streeting said.
Right, but you did think Israel had the right to defend itself in the immediate aftermath.
Of course it has. All countries have the right to defend themselves, but what we're seeing goes well beyond self-defence.
Right, why isn't Sir Keir Starmer calling for an immediate ceasefire? Why doesn't he just say, let's have an immediate ceasefire? He's pretty well saying it.
Well, the Labour Party has had a position for an immediate truce for some time now. I think you've reported that we've said that for quite some time, an immediate truce.
I thought it was a sustainable ceasefire, a ceasefire that lasts.
And leading to, and one that lasts, and leading to a sustainable solution. I'm really worried that we're missing the big picture here. And what it means is that instead of having the proper debate that we need about how we're going to achieve a move forward that's going to see an end to the fighting, that's going to see a sustainable ceasefire, that's going to see an end to the fighting on all sides, and that we're going to have the political process with the recognition of Palestine and a sustainable two-state solution. That's where we've got to focus. That's where, when we are meeting and talking to representatives from other countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Qatar or others, that political process is really important. And I've read the SNP motion.
Well, hang on, let's
All
just
of
explain to the viewers that this,
and
on
that's
Wednesday,
important
the SNP,
to talk
for the
about
second time, are going to call a vote, or having a vote, where they too are going to have, or want to say that they want to see an immediate ceasefire by the Israelis. Now, last time, I think it was about 56 Labour MPs decided to vote in favour of that and against what was Labour's line. What would you say to your colleagues this time?
Well, I haven't seen the motion. It hasn't been published on the order paper, and we don't know what's going to happen on Wednesday. What I would say is this, that we abstained on the SNP motion, but we voted for our own motion, which often happens in parliamentary debate. And that called for an end to hostilities on all sides. And it outlined a political process as well.
Right.
That's really important. How can we not be talking about the long-term solution that we need to see and instead be caught in these debates which aren't making the difference? We need more than a vote in Parliament to make the difference in the Middle East.
I mean, isn't that the point, that all this navel-gazing about motions and language is detracting, I mean, factions within the Labour Party, detracting from what is the substance of an extremely important and critical debate about what you think a sustainable ceasefire is?
They obscure what are real differences, I think.
Right.
Because
So why do you keep arguing about it?
Because we want to get into a position where the killing stops immediately and
Hostages returned, humanitarian aid in,
and
all
also
of this
Palestinian
is
prisoners
agreement.
are released and the occupation ends. You know, we've heard here there's a deadline of for the Palestinians to release the hostages. Where's the deadline for Israel to release the Palestinian prisoners? There's thousands of those. Where's the deadline for them to end their 57-year occupation of Palestine? You know, where's the deadline? Otherwise sanctions will be put on.
Right.
Those things aren't being talked about, and they are the substantial issues.
Right, because both of you are arguing.
Well, we have also, David Lammy has also outlined our view to the Foreign Secretary that we don't support a military offensive on Rafah. There are over 1.5 million there, and relatives of my constituents too, people who have lost their homes in the north of Gaza, people who are fighting over animal feed to feed their families, hospitals that are no longer functioning. International aid needs to be let in, and we need a political solution to this.
Right,
We
and
need
does
a
that
return of the
right?
hostages
Well, you talked
and
about a
international
sustainable
aid.
ceasefire. Do you think Hamas, either of you, both of you, is a acceptable negotiating partner?
Well, look, I think there's a bigger picture here. We've said, I think we all agree, there needs to be an end to Hamas in Gaza. Look, there's no credible future with Hamas in leadership in Gaza, is there? Because
and that's the point. That's why it's very difficult to find a sustainable ceasefire, Andrew. Because if you don't think Hamas is a reasonable negotiating partner, they broke the truce before. Then how can you have an immediate ceasefire?
Well, because you have to try and negotiate that with both sides, as is being done. And there was a ceasefire.
Even though they're committed to destroying Israel.
But Netanyahu is dedicated to a greater Israel that wipes out Gaza and the West Bank, and we're seeing that continuing with the ethnic cleansing on the West Bank right now,
but
as is going on.
As we call in the trade, whataboutery. If you are looking, if you are looking at the issue in terms of an immediate ceasefire, there has to be someone that is credible.
There has to be people on both sides to achieve it, and there is actually, unfortunately, on neither side. That's why it takes diplomatic pressure from Israel's allies on Israel and from people who can talk to Hamas in Qatar and Egypt and elsewhere to put that pressure on Hamas. That has to be achieved.
That's exactly why the conversations that Keir and David have been having with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with our European allies, has been about this political dialogue and the solution we need, alongside the return of hostages.
Let me bring in which was broken by Hamas. Let's talk to David and Jo. Why doesn't the government? You are in government. Why doesn't the government call for an immediate ceasefire?
Well, look, let me preface what I'm about to say by making the point that I've been a long-standing supporter of Palestine, and I've called for the recognition of the statehood of Palestine on the floor of the House. But what Hamas has done has brought disaster upon the people of Gaza. The events of the 7th of October were absolutely dreadful, and they're continuing to detain over 1,000 Israeli hostages. Now, until such time as those hostages are released, they are giving every justification to the State of Israel to prosecute the war in Gaza. They could put an end to it by releasing the hostages, which is what they ought to do. Until then, frankly, motions in the House of Commons calling for a ceasefire, when it's quite clear that neither Hamas nor Israel wants a ceasefire, are fairly illusory.
Right.
What we need to do, and what we are doing, is to continue the heavy lifting diplomatically, both here and in Cairo, and making sure that the pressure for a ceasefire is maintained on both sides.
Right, but more than 28,000 Palestinians have been killed, according to Hamas, which is regarded as a terrorist organisation. But those are the figures that they have. Isn't it incumbent on the government to say something? It isn't just about motions, it is about pressure that is brought to bear as well, as Andrew was saying, that these things are important not just for people who have, who are invested in this issue, but also for other world leaders.
Well, that pressure is being maintained. And in fact, David Lammy said only over the weekend that it's diplomatic pressure that will produce the results and not motions in the House of Commons. I mean, frankly, the debate on Wednesday, I believe, is really rather tokenistic because it will have no effect on either combatant. And what we need to do is to make sure that this horrible process is brought to an end. I actually believe that Israel is engaging in something completely disproportionate in Gaza at the moment. But they're given the justification by Hamas by the continued detention of those hostages.
Jo, looking at this as it's gone on since October the 7th, what do you think politicians, leaders of both, but all the parties, should be doing at this point? Does any of it make any real difference?
I think there's something quite depressing about the semantics over bits of language, which I think, quite frankly, serves to almost trivialise what's going on, because it becomes a debate about the word of immediate or lasting or whatever. And fundamentally, there are nuances. There's diplomacy exists for a reason, and there are things that are read into language and how things are expressed. But I also don't believe that having some sort of Punch and Judy show in Parliament on Wednesday is going to necessarily help. What will happen is afterwards, all the headlines will be about who did and didn't resign and who did or didn't support it. And actually, I don't think that helps people that have got kids at school that are worried about their safety in the UK. I don't think that helps people who've got family that are out in the war zone now. It doesn't really move us very far forward at all, sadly.
And it has
putting pressure on the government, right, as well in Parliament. I mean, Parliament's job is to hold the government to account.
Do we really believe that happens? I mean, do you really think that everyone's quaking in their boots because the SNP are going to put down a motion on Wednesday?
I don't think they're quaking in their boots, but I think an expression of where Parliament sits on an issue is important. And that is what we send our MPs to Parliament to do, to give us that view.
Well, and it has had an impact, of course, on the Rochdale by-election, Seema, because the Labour candidate, as was, because you won't have one now in that by-election officially, by Azhar Ali, who made the comments that the Egyptians, this is talking about Israel deliberately allowing 1,400 of its citizens to be massacred on October the 7th in order to give it the green light to invade Gaza. He said the Egyptians are saying that they warned Israel 10 days earlier. Americans warned them a day before that something is happening. They deliberately took the security off. They allowed that massacre that gives them the green light to do whatever they, he says, bloody want. Why wasn't he sacked immediately?
Those comments were appalling.
Right.
And
well, if they were so appalling, why didn't you just get rid of him immediately as the candidate?
I think what we have also seen as this has unfolded is that the full transcript of what had been said wasn't available at the beginning. And those who had known Mr. Ali over a long period of time had seen his views and his against anti-Semitism.
Those words were available.
There was also a very good piece in the Sunday Times about this yesterday and about some of the complexity around this. But those who had stood by him, like Louise Ellman and others in the beginning, when further comments came to light, it was within 2 days, and this is over a weekend as well, that the support for his candidacy was withdrawn. And that's pretty fast. It's pretty unprecedented in these circumstances.
Well, it was, Andrew,
and in a live by-election.
I think you were right in that those comments alone are far more offensive than some of the comments made by some of Seema's colleagues who are suspended from the whip in the House of Commons right now. They are appalling. I mean, they're a complete fantasy that they deliberately took off security the day before.
Well, it's a conspiracy.
It is a conspiracy theory, a wild conspiracy theory.
But they did get rid of... Labour did sack him.
They did get to the right position. It did take perhaps a day longer than it could have done. But look, they got to the right position, which is this person is not fit to be an MP, frankly, let alone to serve under a Labour Party banner. And that's fine. I mean, unfortunately, it means the people of Rochdale are denied the option of voting for a Labour candidate in this by-election. So... that's fairly small fry in the grand scheme of things, but it does, I think, show that there are still problems around this issue within the Labour Party. and there are within society as well. Let's face it, any major political party is going to have people in it who hold homophobic views, sexist views, and Islamophobic views, anti-Semitic
Fine,
views.
but are you saying that Labour and Seema in this particular case are treating different MPs or candidates within the Labour Party on this issue?
There's clearly a double standard. I'm not accusing Seema of this. I don't think she has any role in this, to be fair to her. But yes, clearly there is a double standard. If you look at what Kate Osmore tweeted, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it was nowhere near as offensive as what Azhar Ali had said. And he was defended by shadow cabinet members on the media that
So it's competing levels of offence.
It's not competing.
There's an interesting point about what was worse.
consistency.
I think the bit that everyone is missing is that there is an ongoing conflict, and what he said was about the actions of a foreign government, and it was actually quite dangerous what he was saying.
And
I think more than whether it offended anyone, it was actually about the fact that if you want to hold a position as an MP, he'd have been somebody who, if he'd have been in an election last week, he'd have been having a vote on Wednesday. And that's the bit that these people need to be better vetted, and when they're not suitable, they should be slung out.
Exactly, because those views weren't formed on the day he uttered them. He held those views beforehand. And where was the due diligence on the part of the Labour Party when they selected him as a candidate?
All right, let's have a...
I think we have to be careful. There's a lot of Conservative MPs who have been embroiled in scandal and sacked over the last...
Let's just stick with this particular story. Let me just show you all the candidates. You can see here on the screen who will be standing on the Rochdale by-election. That is the full list of candidates taking place on the 29th, I think I've got that right, of February, which is next Thursday. Let's talk about the Post Office. This is the Sunday Times headline. Post Office boss, I was told to stall compensation to help Tories. Henry Staunton had only been in post since 2022, but when he was sacked, he says Kemi Badenoch told him someone's got to take the rap. He was chairman of the Post Office, who at the end of January stepped down amid ongoing tensions around the Horizon IT scandal that saw hundreds, of course, as you will know, of sub-postmasters wrongly convicted. Now, in response, Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary, tweeted this. My call with Staunton was with officials. They took a complete record. He has given an interview full of lies about our conversation during his dismissal. The details will soon emerge, or will emerge soon enough, as I won't let the matter rest here, and we'll be discussing with government lawyers. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Harry Farley. Just give us a little bit more context and background to this row.
Yes, well, Jo, I think there's two key claims that you set out there that Henry Staunton makes in his interview with the Sunday Times. The first and potentially most politically damaging for the government is that he had a conversation with a civil servant, he says, in which he was told to stall compensation to the Post Office former sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses in order to allow the government to limp on, in his words, to the election with the lowest possible financial liability. And the second damaging claim for the government that he makes is that when he had a call with the business secretary, Kemi Badenoch, that she told him that someone had to, in his words, take the rap for this. And as you said, the government strongly denies these allegations. And when I was speaking to sources in the business department yesterday morning, it was clear they were very angry about this interview. They said that the claims were rubbish, and they said that the blame passing, in their words, was a feature of Mr. Staunton's time at the Post Office. And then, as you say, those tweets from the business secretary, Kemi Badenoch, addressing those two key claims, I suppose. She says that on his allegation that he was told to stall payments, to stall compensation payments, she denies that, and she accuses him of lacking a grip of getting justice for postmasters when he was chair of the Post Office. And on the other claim that he was sacked so that someone could take the fall for it, she says that was a disgraceful misrepresentation of their call. So a very angry response from the department and from the business secretary herself.
Harry Farley, thank you very much. Now, this morning, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, was on the Today programme, and she was asked whether the government would release, or at least had, notes or evidence that backed up what Kemi Badenoch has said at the time about those conversations with Henry Staunton. Let's take a listen.
My understanding is that the government made clear in the appointment letter that focusing on and prioritising the compensation for sub-postmasters was a key aspect of the job. Now, obviously, he's been dismissed from that role, and there's been some articles in the Times, and I know some follow-up with my colleague, and I'm sure they'll be following up.
She's accused him of lying. Is she, as the government, going to be releasing notes of the conversation that backs that up?
Well, I haven't spoken to her about it, but I know that she has said that
it's a government decision, isn't it?
It was all recorded, and she said that she will be making a statement.
Gillian Keegan there. What do you make, David, of the way Kemi Badenoch has tweeted accusing the former chairman of the Post Office of lying?
Well, my suspicion is that she wouldn't have done that unless she was pretty sure of what she was saying. And I think that we'll hear a lot more today. This afternoon there's going to be a statement in the House. But I can't believe that Kemi would in fact be so bullish, be so adamant as to put out a series of tweets of the sort that she did, unless she was very sure of her ground. And one point that Gillian Keegan made in that clip is that, of course, there was a letter
I have it.
Sent to Mr. Staunton at the time of his appointment, which made it absolutely clear that focusing on the issue of Horizon and ensuring the compensation of the postmasters was something he should regard as a priority.
Right. I mean, that's point 3. There are 3 points. I'm not going to read them all. You're right. It's about resolving historical litigation issues. But point 1 to Henry Staunton is effective financial management and performance, including effective management of legal costs to ensure medium-term viability. What do you make of Kemi Badenoch's, how can I put it, tactic of tweeting about Henry Staunton lying, in her words?
Well, I don't think it's a good look. I'm not sure it's the way that government should be conducting business. The bit that I find quite astonishing is there are 2 very specific allegations. One is about a civil servant saying something. Now, I'd be shocked if, as business secretary, she was able to find out who that civil servant was and which conversation, and be that confident that that conversation never happened, because that's what he said. He said that he was told by a civil servant to slow down the compensation process. Well, but how do you find that? I'm not being funny, but I'm lucky if I can find my bank statements on a Sunday when I'm at home, or that remember the password to something. The idea that the business secretary is that confident of that particular meeting between a civil servant and him, different about the conversation she had. She might be very clear that she adamantly did not say those words. That's the bit, I don't know who to believe. I actually think the whole thing's been such a mess. And you have to take a step back and say, this is one compensation scheme that isn't happening. What about the infected blood scandal people who still haven't been paid out either? You have to question what's going on. And the best thing the government could be doing is paying out pretty quick, because that's going to show whether they did, whether they're
and isn't that the point?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, isn't Jo completely right that surely is where the government should be focusing?
Well, absolutely. I don't think anyone disagrees with that.
Well, except it seems Kemi Badenoch, who seems to want to focus, and maybe Henry Staunton, on this.
Well, I think it's probably Mr. Staunton who is protecting his own position, but we'll hear about that this afternoon. But look, this is a scandal that has been going on for almost 20 years, and under successive governments it has not been properly addressed. We had one drama which was put out earlier this year, and that's had the most extraordinary effect.
On government, it seems, as well as on the
Well,
public.
indeed, but I don't think anyone would disagree with what the government is doing now, which is...
Where's the bill? I mean, we were promised this. I seem to remember Kevin Hollinrake standing up.
We were promised it
PMQ's...
last month, and we're a few weeks later. No, I think that the bill will be coming forward. We've got to make sure that the postmasters and postmistresses get justice, and we've got to make sure that they're compensated properly, and that's what the government is intent upon doing.
Well, it is really important there's a statement today, because they're very serious allegations, and questions should be asked, because look, the Horizon scandal is one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history, and it shouldn't have taken a documentary for there to be faster government action. When I was Shadow Business Minister, it was clear then how slow the government was moving on all of this.
Well, it was clear before you came to the House, Seema. I remember taking it up with your predecessors.
Well, look, I think in terms of the last 14 years, it's been pretty slow, hasn't it? But I think this is the real point here is that under no circumstances should compensation to victims be being delayed for party political purposes, and that's a central question.
Well, do you know that's what's happened?
That's why it needs to be asked. That's the allegation made.
So should we wait until Kemi Badenoch stands up and hopefully...
That is exactly why we need the statement today.
All right.
That's why Johnny Reynolds has also written to Kemi Badenoch. We
and
need
of course,
that transparency.
Well, we're going to
what is interesting is that it's Kemi herself who was called for that statement.
Right, and it's happening this afternoon. So let's wait and see what she actually says.
But I just want to make this one point about other areas that could be affected, like the infected blood scandal. I think this is really affecting trust and the feeling that there is common decency in government, decisions being made in the interest of the people and not in the interest of political parties.
Just before we move on, I'll be joined on tomorrow's programme by the singer Will Young, who will explain why he's now campaigning to end medical testing on dogs. So tune in and join me at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. I know you were going to anyway. Let me just show you this headline in The Telegraph, following on from the by-elections last week. You can't move for by-elections. So John Curtis, the sphologist, in some ways, Reform, the party, is as big a problem as Labour for Sunak now. These were the by-elections last week that the Tories lost both of them. Labour gained both of them. It has led to an awful lot of soul-searching, which you would understand in the sort of post-mortem. David, Labour to the left of you, Reform to the right, as the song goes, while in other seats the Lib Dems are the main challengers. Should the Tories do a deal with Reform ahead of the general election?
No, absolutely not. The Conservative Party must fight the next election as the Conservative Party. But what we saw last week was the effect of Reform upon the Conservative vote. They nibble away at the edges. And if you looked at the Kingswood by-election, the Reform vote was almost exactly the same as the Labour.
So what do you do about it?
What you do is you fight as Conservatives.
But what does that mean, David?
Well,
you lost those by-elections. As you say, Reform took 10%, I think, and 13% in the by-elections in Wellingborough and Kingswood.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's no doubt that the Conservative Party has got problems at the moment. That's self-evidence from last week's results.
But what's your solution?
Well, what we need to do is to govern as Conservatives. We need to make sure. Well, we need to, for a start, to cut taxes. We've got an opportunity on the 6th of March, when we have the budget, to reduce taxes. Conservative Party is nothing if it's not a low tax party, and the taxes are far too high, and everyone recognises that. The other thing that I think that the party needs to do as a matter of urgency, which in fact, to be fair, it is doing, is to address the issue of migration, which I think every MP will know is one of the top issues raised in his or her postbag.
Right.
We've got the Rwanda bill going through the Lords at the moment. The sooner that is actually made law, the better, and we can start seeing the movement of people.
But Dave, would you prioritise tax cuts over compensating the post office?
Well, I don't believe that question arises.
But if they're saying there's no money and it's being delayed because they don't want to pay out,
we haven't actually heard that from anybody yet. So I think that, frankly, is a bit of a false argument.
Well, except are tax cuts, is that the overriding thing you think the party should do, is offer tax cuts?
Absolutely, because
so, yes, it is. It seems more
a
priority.
There's a much bigger picture here, isn't there? Because what people were voting for, I was in Kingswood myself last week, and I met a lot of voters who were Conservative voters who were saying they're never voting Conservative again. And it isn't just about one issue. We know the Reform Party, in large part, are disillusioned Conservatives who are to the right of where Rishi Sunak is. But what people were actually saying is that things are broken. They were talking about the NHS. They were talking about jobs. They were talking about opportunities for young people.
So why did Reform do so well? Why did Labour not pick up more of those votes? If people are so disillusioned and never going to vote Tory again, they're voting Reform and not Labour.
There are a lot of people who, I think you'll know this as well, Jo, obviously being so seasoned in politics. It can be quite a step to vote for another political party or move from being Tory to Labour. And I think this is why last week was so important, because people who have voted Tory are putting their trust in a changed Labour Party, and they want change in Britain. They want change. They want to fix broken
that wasn't
Britain.
clear from that
and they want
last week.
No, it
wasn't. What in
Party
fact we saw last week, Seema, with respect, was a lot of Conservatives simply staying at home.
There are a lot who stayed at home as well, but there's also a lot
and that made all the difference. And to revert to the point that I was making earlier, we need to give people more incentive to vote Conservative again. And I believe that top of the list must be to allow people to keep more money in their pocket.
And you mentioned, let
if I just want to correct him on one thing, because there was a point that some Conservative voters made to me, which was that they weren't going to vote Conservative, but they weren't sure they would vote Labour yet, and they wanted to hear more about what the Labour Party was saying.
All right.
And that is really important, because it's about us building and keeping the trust of the British people.
Well, there's another by-election, of course, next week. Let's just have a look at this in The Independent. You mentioned immigration. Minister claims he can guarantee flights to Rwanda before the general election. You'll have heard your colleague saying it on Sunday show with Laura Kunsberg. The pledge comes after Sunak's £1,000 bet, etc. Do you believe him?
Well, yes, I do believe him, because I think that if the Lords pass this bill, which I believe that they should, we will start seeing flights taking off very soon after the bill becomes law.
Right. I mean, you say the bill was completely useless, inoperable, I think was your word. And ineffective. So you don't believe?
It could have been a lot better, but frankly, I think that we should give...
So why did you vote against it then,
I voted
David?
against it because I believe that we needed a stronger bill, but the bill is the bill that we've got. It's undoubtedly going to have a few amendments in the Lords. I'll be happy to support the government in making sure that the bill isn't weakened further. And then let's see what happens when the bill has been made law.
OK, well, that sounds like a slight change of mind in terms of the bill that's going through.
Hugely,
that you didn't,
still.
well, you didn't think it would be effective to start with. But anyway, you now think those planes will... Well, yes, on the substance, of course, you disagree completely. But the former Tory party chairman, Chris Patten, has warned the Conservative Party not to play footsie with reform. Let's have a listen.
When you look at the fall in the Conservative vote in those by-elections, it was awful. And the real danger of those results for the Conservative Party is because of the Reform Party, getting 10%, people will start saying, oh, well, if we appeal to the Reform Party, we can just add their 10% to ours. That is complete drivel. If the Conservative Party starts playing footsie with the Reform Party, it won't stand a prayer of winning the next election.
What's your response?
I think that Chris Patten and I are in agreement.
Oh!
We certainly don't want to play footsie with Reform or anyone else. We want to win the next election as the Conservative Party.
Right. Winning the election as the Conservative Party, what does that say to you, Jo?
Well, it's pretty much fantastical, isn't it? It's not looking very likely. And I think the point about turnout is a really big issue. I think we're going to see a significantly low turnout at the general election. I think people are just sick. I think they're getting sick of politics, full stop. I think they're fed up with politicians. I think they're fed up that they feel nothing really materially changes for them. And the issue with people like Reform is that they can just say stuff. It's like the Lib Dems. They can say things that sound quite appealing, but they don't necessarily have to put all the detail out straight away. Whereas Labour, every time they announce something, the full detail is wanted to be poured over. And if they can't substantiate stuff, they shy away from really putting much out there, because that's the difficulty you get into when you're that close to government. And for the Tories, really, nobody knows what they're voting for. In the by-elections, what were they voting for? More of the same. Well, they didn't really like what they were getting, so they're not going to vote for it. So to some extent, the by-elections are not really telling us much about what's going to happen, because we don't really know what the offer is from the party, except Labour won't be the Conservatives and the other parties won't be the Conservatives. And if you just don't like the Conservatives, you then won't vote for them.
Well, some rebel Tory MPs. Let me just show you the headline in The Guardian. Rebel Tory MPs pushing for Rishi Sunak to quit before he is deposed. They have a new plan for the leadership. Is that a quote from you, David?
Certainly not. If I were doing that sort of stuff, I wouldn't be on this show.
Right. Is it, well, it's unnamed, but anyway, very good of you to clarify. Is this the time to change the Prime Minister at all?
We need to give Rishi Sunak the opportunity he needs to win the next election. And as I say, I think that the budget on the 6th of March is the opportunity to show that we are a low-tax party.
If he doesn't deliver on the budget, he and Jeremy Hunt, you say he has the opportunity. If he doesn't deliver, what then?
Well, I believe he will deliver, because I think that Jeremy Hunt fully recognises that we need to move to a lower tax regime.
But if he doesn't deliver, David,
that's
will you
hugely
then...
hypothetical.
It's not that hugely hypothetical. It's only March the 6th, and there's been a lot of debate about tax cuts or not.
Let's wait until March the 6th. But I actually believe that Jeremy Hunt understands the issue and he will deliver.
Do you think Rishi Sunak will lead your party into the next election?
Absolutely.
Right. Whatever happens on March the 6th.
Well, I very much hope so.
It's just incredible. It's just another rotating door of the Tory party with no plan for the future. Absolutely nothing different in terms of politics.
Seema, we've run out
future.
of time. It's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.